In this second lecture for this module, we're going to take a look at the African American contributions to the Civil War. We'll pay particular attention to military service and what some people have described as the transformative power of military service for African American men. We'll look at blacks in the Army and in the Navy. We'll look at the impact of the questions, of the use of black troops, the role that black troops would play in the Confederate Army, and then finally at violence against blacks in the North during the Civil War. The Emancipation Proclamation authorized the enlistment of black men, but some commanders had already taken the initiative to do this even before the proclamation was issued. General David Hunter, for example, felt that enlistment was justified by Union defeats. They were losing manpower, and they needed to get more soldiers. He began recruiting former slaves in May of 1862 along the South Carolina coast and the Sea Islands. Some blacks didn't want to enlist, and Hunter just simply forced them to volunteer. Hunter eventually organized 500 black men into the 1st South Carolina Volunteers. On the other hand, Thomas Wentworth Higginson was appointed by General Rufus Saxton to shape up Hunter's 1st South Carolina Volunteers after the Emancipation Proclamation. And this group was eventually accepted into the U.S. Army as the 2nd South Carolina Volunteers. In another instance, Robert Gould Shaw organized the 54th Massachusetts, again after the Emancipation Proclamation. For African Americans, freed or slave or freed, military service was said to have a kind of a transformative power. Now, I think that some of you have probably seen all or parts of this newspaper illustration, which purports to tell the story of Gordon, quote, a typical Negro. On the left side, you have Gordon when he enters Union lines, kind of ragged. In the center, Gordon when he enters Union lines. He's a slave, he's been whipped, he's been beaten. On the left-hand side, you see him dressed in rags. But then on the right-hand side, you see Gordon as a soldier. And it's what you begin to see here is this whole idea that by serving in the military, this beaten, bedraggled, enslaved man becomes a different kind of person. He gains something in himself. As Frederick Douglass stated concerning this, he says, quote, "Let the black man get upon his person the brass letters U.S. Let him get an eagle on his button and a musket on his shoulder and bullets in his pocket, and there is no power on earth which can deny that he has earned the right to citizenship in the U.S. So this goes beyond just that simple idea of the emancipation of slaves to questions of manhood and masculinity and citizenship, equality in the U.S. Eventually, some 200,000 African American men served in the military. They were organized into segregated units of what became known as the U.S. Colored Troops. They were roughly about 14% of the black male population in the U.S. between the ages of 18 and 46. And most of them came from the southern and the border states. Contrary to most opinions, or the idea that black troops that are serving are going to be coming from the northern states, most of the black troops that are serving in the military during the Civil War are Southerners. They are recently freed or emancipated people men who've been drafted out of the contraband camps in some cases. By the end of the Civil War, about 40% of the Union Army in Tennessee, or about 20,000 men, were African American troops. African Americans, again, were divided into separate, segregated units most of which were commanded by white officers, although there were about 100 black officers commissioned during the war. Most of these newly commissioned black officers came from the Louisiana Native Guards, or the Louisiana troops. Other officers included Martin Delany. You remember from antebellum fame, he was a Northern nationalist leader, a counterpart of Frederick Douglass. Two of Frederick Douglass's own sons served in the African American regiments during the Civil War, as did James Monroe Trotter, who served with the 54th Massachusetts. African American troops in the military during the Civil War faced discrimination in pay as well as training. They fought in more than 250 battles across the Confederate States, across the South during the Civil War. But again, they did face that question of discrimination. The pay discrimination was only resolved after a major protest of black troops. Initially, white privates were paid $13 a month. Black privates were paid $10 a month. When some of the troops were first training, they were not even issued weapons. They trained with broomsticks. However, there was a strong realization that these troops could be very valuable in fighting the war. And again, they did serve in over 250 battles. About 200 black Union soldiers were imprisoned at the notorious Andersonville prison in Georgia, where they performed daily burial duty at the camp. And indeed, many of them, about 111 black soldiers, died at the camp. They were also Other captured black soldiers were held at Confederate prisons in Salisbury, Danville, Libby, just across the South. Now, getting back to what I said about the 250 battles, this map shows where these battles occurred. And again, it's all across the South, some of them in and around Memphis, Pulaski, Tennessee, Clarksville, Battle of Franklin, Nashville, Chattanooga, Fort Pillow you see on the map. So what you see here is that these troops were used throughout the Union Army, some fighting as far up into Kentucky or West Virginia. Camp life during the Civil War was difficult for any soldiers. It was monotonous, it was boring, and it was just about as deadly, or in fact, in some cases, even more deadly than the battles themselves. The mortality rate for black troops, however, was 40% higher than the mortality rate for white troops. Over 38,000 black troops were killed over the course of the Civil War. Diseases took a very heavy toll, and you have to realize that many of those black troops who were enlisted in the military were former slaves. So in many cases, they were not in the best of health to begin with. For every 2 white soldiers who died of disease in these camps, you had almost twice as many black soldiers who died. I'm sorry, not just twice as many, 10 times as many black soldiers who died. 1 out of every 10 white soldiers died of disease. 1 out of every 5 black soldiers died of disease. Black men also served in the Navy. And in terms of the Navy, there was a very strong tradition of naval service for blacks that dated back to the 1790s. However, there was a difference between their service in the Navy and service in the Army. In the Navy, black men were more than likely serving in integrated, as a part of integrated crews on naval vessels, but they faced the same level of racial prejudice and discrimination and exploitation of their labor. They were again paid less. They did the hardest and the filthiest task on the boats. Many of them served as stewards, waiting on the officers and the crewmen on these ships. By the end of the Civil War, about 30 of the 120 men in the Union Navy were black men. And blacks also served as spies, as guides, as workers, or as searchers of people going in and out across the lines. Black women faced difficult times, particularly Southern black women, as the Civil War started. As more and more black men were drafted into the Union Army, out of the contraband camps, those women who had followed their husbands and fathers and brothers away from the plantations and to these camps were in effect set adrift. There wasn't much for them to do if they left the plantations to come to these camps in the first place. And the only jobs that they could find were as field laborers or as cooks or as washerwomen. However, some of them did serve as spies or guides, along with black men. And there are three really good examples of this. In May of 1862, Robert Smalls, who was a 23-year-old slave, sailed a Confederate supply ship called the Planter past Confederate fortifications to the Union fleet outside the Charleston harbor. He was assisted by 7 black crewmen, and as a result of his efforts, he managed to liberate himself and 15 other slaves, including the families of several crewmen and his own wife, daughter, and son. In 1863, Harriet Tubman, you remember from before the Civil War, who had made several trips into the South to help slaves escape, Harriet Tubman organized a spy ring in the South Carolina Low Country, and in cooperation with the all-black 2nd South Carolina Volunteer Regiment, she helped to organize an expedition that destroyed plantations and freed about 800 slaves. Mary Elizabeth Bowser worked at the Confederate White House in Richmond, and it is reported that she reported on conversations that she overheard between Jefferson Davis and his subordinates. She told about these conversations to Union spies, and eventually had to escape herself when the Confederates became suspicious of her efforts. And John Henry Woodson served as a guide for the Union General Philip Sheridan and his cavalry in 1864 and 1865. So you can see that black service during the war went beyond just simply military service in the Army or in the Navy. Now, to take a look at a more controversial issue, we look at the question of what role did blacks play in the Confederacy. There were some blacks who supported the Confederacy for any number of reasons. First of all, there were the rumors and sometimes the realities of the cruelty of the Union Army in the South toward blacks. There were fear of reprisals against blacks if the South won the war. If they had assisted the Union, then there was this great fear that if the South happened to win, that they would suffer, that they would be punished or killed. Some chose to remain with what they knew, and they chose to remain in the South because that was home. And others felt a deep loyalty to their owners. For the Confederacy, though, the use or the question of what role would blacks play in this military effort was a complex issue. And the key question or the key reason is that the Confederacy itself was based on a defense of slavery. So you couldn't have a situation emerge where you're going to send slaves into battle to fight, give them weapons to fight. As many Southerners pointed out, this seemed to fly in the face of all arguments, all questions of the nature of slavery. On the other hand, Confederate law demonstrated a great fear of the possibility of a slave rebellion. And you could see this in what became known as the 20 Nigger Law, which basically exempted any planter, any person, any men who owned 20 slaves or more. They were exempt from the Confederate draft. Now, to be considered a planter, a person had to own 20 slaves. So in effect, this becomes kind of a rich man's war and a poor man's fight, because it is the non-slaveholding Southerners who are in effect not exempt, not able to get out of the draft, and who will be sent into battle, whereas the wealthy planters can figure out ways to keep from having to go if they choose to do this. Many of them chose to go and lead troops, but on the other hand, they could be exempt from the draft because it was felt that they were needed at home to make sure that the slaves did not, that there were no slave rebellions, or to protect the home front in effect. Southerners and planters also benefited from the labors of slaves, even if they didn't enlist them in the military. Slaves continued to work in the fields. They were needed to get the crops in, to get them to continue the production in the factories. Black labor, in effect, allowed more white men to serve in the military. So there was a complex economic role, even if it was not seen as being good. The idea of having blacks serve was not seen as being a good idea. In what proved to be probably the worst example of what could happen, or rather the Southern attitude toward blacks who were serving in the Union Army, generally speaking, they took the attitude that any black person who had taken up arms against the Confederacy was very guilty, almost guilty of violating those antebellum slave codes. They looked at these men as slaves, even though they had escaped or had left the plantations. And they did, in fact, declare that all slaves who were captured with weapons, meaning those soldiers, those black soldiers who were carrying weapons or had been given weapons, and were soldiers in the Union Army, they were seeing them or viewing them as slaves, that all the slaves that were captured with weapons would be sent back to states of their origin and dealt with according to those laws. So if you are a freed person, if you are a black soldier who is enlisted in the Tennessee Army, the Union Army in Tennessee, and you are from Mississippi, if you're captured, then you'll be sent back to Mississippi. And according to the Confederacy, you would be dealt with in terms of the laws of Mississippi concerning slaves with weapons. Some captured Union soldiers, black Union soldiers, were actually sold into slavery. Others were killed. And the Fort Pillow Massacre was probably the worst example of what could happen to black troops. Confederate forces under General Nathan Bedford Forrest, who before the Civil War had been a slave trader and a planter, these forces, Forrest's forces, captured Fort Pillow on April the 12th of 1864. And soon after they captured them, they proceeded to wipe out the black troops that were at the fort. Some accounts said that the blacks would not surrender. Even though they had, been asked to surrender, they would not. After they were captured, there were reports that some were burned, some were buried alive. A federal congressional investigating committee eventually verified that more than 300 blacks, including women and children, had been slain after the fort surrendered. After this incident, black soldiers who went into battle used the battle cry, "Remember Fort Pillow." Later in that year, the South agreed to treat black soldiers as prisoners of war. And as I mentioned before, there was evidence that there were black soldiers at the notorious Andersonville prison camp, as well as at some other Southern prison camps. Eventually, however, military demands, the lack of manpower, forced the Confederacy to change its position on the use of black troops. Very early in the war, they had considered and had actually impressed or drafted free blacks into military service. Jefferson Davis, after Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation, had issued a counter proclamation stating, quote, all free Negroes shall be placed on the slave status and be deemed to be chattels forever. So where Lincoln is freeing the slaves, Davis is issuing a counterproposal or proclamation that is enslaving free blacks. He ordered Confederate armies to capture free black people in the North and enslave them. Some Confederate leaders, however, began to realize that the South's biggest drawback in fighting this war, its biggest weakness, was that the lack of manpower. About a quarter of the Southern population was enslaved. And they began to put pressure on President Jefferson Davis to consider enlisting or allowing blacks to enlist or forcing the enlistment of slaves, to kind of pressure the Southern planters to provide slaves for the military. Most Southerners, on the other hand, even though, you have on the one hand, some people saying consider the manpower issue, others are saying that this whole idea of arming slaves is just appalling, that it defied Southern assumptions about the nature of slavery and the nature of slaves. As one man said, quote, "If slaves will make good soldiers, our whole theory of slavery is wrong." But again, manpower needs began to be a priority. And in March of 1865, the Confederate Congress voted to enlist 300,000 slaves. And I remember there are about 200,000 blacks serving in the Union Army. They were to receive the same pay as white soldiers, but the slaves would be freed only with the consent of their owners and their state. There was very little indication, however, of any all-black units of slaves in the Confederate Army. And you must remember that this action is taken by the Confederate Congress in March of 1865, and the Civil War ends in April of 1865. Another aspect of the treatment of blacks during the Civil War was the New York City draft riot. This riot just seemed to erupt out of nowhere in July of 1863. But these causes, the causes of the riot, should have been foreseeable. For one thing, the Union had issued a draft order, and the Union was drafting large numbers of poor white men into military service. The death tolls were going up. And whenever deaths were reported after a battle, like the Battle of Gettysburg, they would just simply publish the list, post the list on the walls. And it was very, very obvious that many of those who were dying were immigrants. Irish men were angry at this whole thing. They faced poverty, they faced discrimination, they faced job competition from black men, free black men in the North. Free black men had actually replaced Irish dock workers or stevedores by June of 1863. Rich white Northerners could purchase an exemption from service, but poor white Northerners could not. So just like a wealthy Southern planter could, in effect, get out of being drafted into the Confederate Army, a wealthy white Northerner could buy his way out of the draft in the Union Army. But poor men could not. So again, it's a rich man's war and a poor man's fight. The draft riot in New York City lasted for about 4 days in July of 1863. And in the aftermath of the riot, or during the riot, the Colored Orphan Asylum was destroyed, as were many black churches, and the homes of prominent Republicans and abolitionists were also destroyed. Now, in the next unit, we'll take a look at the constitutional changes that developed at the end of the Civil War.